Welcome, everybody. My name is Chantal Warner. Together with my colleague, Beatrice Dupuis, I'm a co-director of the Center for Educational Resources for Culture, Language, and Literacy, also known as CIRCLE, here at the University of Arizona. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here, both those of you who are present in the room and also the many remote attendees who are watching us right now. In addition to greeting you, today I've been given a very important task of explaining this very strange disc that you had in your registration packet. Many of you have probably already solved this puzzle already, but this is actually a flash drive. It pops out, and you will find on there not only a digital program for the conference, but also other resources and materials, links to the website where we have even further additional resources and materials that have been developed as part of CIRCLE projects. So please peruse at some point when you have a chance. I also wanted to mention, for those of you who are Twitter inclined, we do have a hashtag. It's hashtag ICC2016, so now you know. And then finally, before turning over the mic, I wanted to say a couple of thank yous to people without whom we wouldn't have been able to put on this event. First of all, our Associate Director, Kate Mackay, who's standing over here and who's been masterfully orchestrating everything that's going on. If we could do a round of applause for Kate. I also wanted to thank our graduate associate, Jake Monzingo, who's standing over here, thank you. And he's been orchestrating lots of things behind the scenes and keeping everything running. And then also, I think she's not in the room, she's out at the registration desk, but our undergraduate associate, Hannah Herrick, who anything that looks really beautiful, such as the program, and also those flash drives, she's responsible for that design, as well as many other things. So if we could give her a thank you as well. I will now hand over the floor to my colleague, the Dean of the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona, Mary Wilner-Bassett.
Thank you, Chantal. Greetings to all of you. It's my real pleasure first to serve as the Dean of the College of Humanities and to proudly talk about how the College of Humanities is the primary home, let's say, for the SLAT program, the Second Language Acquisition and Teaching PhD program. It's an interdisciplinary program. And also from the SLAT program came CIRCLE eventually. And to thank those who have done all of this wonderful work to create this magnificent conference, but also CIRCLE. We are very proud to have CIRCLE with us, of all the work they do, of all the work that all of you are doing about the very important issues of intercultural competence, understanding, and now even more perhaps assessment of what all that means. I'd also like to thank very quickly the organizers and the co-directors of CIRCLE, Beatrice Dupuis, Chantal Warner. Let's have some applause for them, please. Also, of course, a round of support and help for those who have gone before. I see in our audience Lin Hua, Roby Ariev, and there are many more, but let's thank them. They were the ones on whose shoulders we stand now, so let's thank them all. My thanks also, finally, in addition to Kate and Jake and Hannah, for all the work. We know that without those folks, we would never be able to do anything, let alone stand up here and talk and welcome you. So let's thank them again, please. It's very important what they do. I don't want to stand for a long time between you and this excellent keynote speaker, also the wonderful plenary speakers we have, the wonderful sessions. I'm going to try to attend as many as I can. This is, after all, also my home in many different ways. But thank you all for being here, also those who are streaming in. And enjoy this. It's going to be a wonderful, and has already started as a wonderful conference. So welcome, also in the name of the College of Humanities and the University of Arizona. Thanks for being here.
So it is my great pleasure to welcome Fred Dervin to this conference. Fred Dervin is professor of multicultural education at the University of Helsinki in Finland. He also holds several professorships in Canada, Luxembourg, and Malaysia. And in May 2014, he was appointed Distinguished Professor at Baoji University of Arts and Sciences in China. He specializes in intercultural education, the sociology of multiculturalism, and student and academic mobility. And he has widely published in international journals on identity, the intercultural, and mobility and migration in English, Finnish, and French. He has published over 30 books, and in 2015 only, he has published 6 titles, and I'm going to, both in French and in English. So that'll be pretty easy for me to say. The first one was Analyser l'identité, then Diversities and Interculturality in Textbooks, Migration, Diversity, and Education, Chinese Educational Migration and Student-Teacher Mobility, Cultural Essentialism in Intercultural Relations, and finally, La Chine Autrement. He's the series editor of Education Beyond Borders, published with Peter Lang, and Post-Intercultural Communication and Education, published with CSP. So with no further ado, I leave the floor to Fred Dervin, whose keynote address is entitled Intercultural Competence Beyond Orthodoxies. So please welcome Fred Dervin to this podium. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Great. Hello, everyone. I don't know if I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because I came last night, so I'm a bit confused about the time. But it's a real pleasure to be back here. I was in Tucson 2 years ago, and I loved it. So thank you so much for having me here. And I'll start with this. Well, this is my suitcase yesterday when I left Finland, full of snow. But I would like to thank just Beatrice and then Chantel and Kate for organizing. These are just 3 names, but I would also like to greet Ali and Etta, with whom, because I'm going to be staying in Arizona for 2 weeks. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. I told them this morning, you saved my life, because it's so cold in Finland at the moment. So being here is like a holiday. And I know that there are people who are online as well, and I would like to send virtual greetings to Susan if she hears me. So thank you. I'm going to talk about intercultural competence. Now, when I looked at the website of the other conferences, I noticed that I am the first actually keynote from outside the US. And so what I would like to do today is to give you some perspectives that may sound a little bit different for an American audience. I know that a lot of you are from other parts of the world as well. And I would like to start with a quote from Michel Foucault. It's very fashionable these days to start with Foucault, but I will go with the flow because what he says about the role of the intellectual, or the role of the thinker, because we are thinkers in a sense, I think is very relevant for this idea of intercultural competence. So he says, the work of an intellectual is to bring assumptions and things taken for granted again into question, to shake habits, ways of acting and thinking, and to dispel the familiarity of the accepted. Now, I've been working on the idea of intercultural competence for quite a while now, and every time I see the word, that's what I'm trying to do. So I believe we have a responsibility to do that. We need to question accepted meanings and beliefs, and to question ourselves also, and that's what I do quite a bit in my writing. A lot of the work on intercultural competence, and some of the work that I'm doing as well, very often look like what we could call catechism, in a sense that things are repeated and rehearsed and recycled, but there's very little questioning, in a sense, of it. And so what I'm going to say will sound probably very provoking to you. Please forgive me. When I provoke, when I'm critical, I'm actually talking to myself as well. I'm not just talking to you, but I'm talking to me as well. And I do believe, like Arendt, that to think is not to know, and to think is to question, to suspend common understanding. Now, let me start with a prelude and some very bad news from Europe, which I think, of course, is very relevant for reflecting on intercultural competence. Some of you might have seen this gentleman. I come from Finland. I wasn't born in Finland, but I've lived in Finland for 21 years. And Finnish education and Finland as a little paradise, heaven on this planet, has been put on the table by people like Pasi Sahlberg. And recently, on his Twitter account, he reminded us that Finland ranks number 2 on the list of countries that do most good for the planet. That's a new ranking, which is called the Good Country Index. I mean, there are millions of new rankings, but this one, number 1 is, do you know which one is doing the most good to the world? Sorry? Oh, Ireland. Oh, yeah, it says there. Yeah, okay. So Ireland. Sorry. Teacher question. Good, 10 points. So Ireland, Finland, Switzerland. So we're number 2. And Salberg is very happy to tell us, of course, that news about Finland. What I thought was quite ironic, actually, on his Twitter account, that one day earlier he had this quote from Martin Luther King, which says, "To save man from the morass of propaganda, in my opinion, is one of the chief aims of education." But then one day later, he's throwing at us this sort of propaganda about Finland being number 2 on the list of countries. Well, never mind. So this is the official discourse about Finland at the moment. But of course, the situation at the moment is very scary. You might have seen what happened in September when a group of refugees was coming into one of our cities. They were welcomed by people dressed up as KKK members, and they were throwing stones and fireworks at a bus. And on that same week, when you try to Google the name Finland, this is what you could find. Finland, Ku Klux Klan, Finland, Finlandia, Finland, KKK. So that's really bad for us because we'll probably drop in the good country. Also, recently, you've probably heard about the fact that some people are organizing like private militia that are going around our cities to protect ourselves against refugees and migrants, because they're very dangerous, especially they're very interested in our women. And then this sort of horrible picture also, a future refugee center burned down by some people who didn't want to have refugees in their city. So this is, and of course all these headlines about, the far right, etc., etc., etc. So this is bad news from Europe, because it's not just happening in Finland. Of course, there are people who are trying to do good things, but there's also a lot of negative things happening, and not just in Finland again. But what I find more worrying, in a sense, is what we are trying to do about intercultural competence, for instance, at the Council of Europe. Some of you might have seen this announcement last March, where we were told by the Council of Europe that pioneering work on democratic competences is being done in Strasbourg. What's interesting about this announcement is that the word democratic seems to be used as a synonym or as a complement to the word intercultural. And I've lost that bit on my slide. But basically what they're trying to do is to find what they call a universal and objective system to define and measure the democratic competencies required to function in our societies. And they've started defining 20 core competencies, which will be universal and objective, to measure people's competencies. And these are some of the components. And I've highlighted some of the components which are so problematic that I really have no idea how these could be measured. So responsibility, okay, whatever that means. Tolerance, that's one of the terms that, for instance, in my research group, we have rejected. Because the idea of tolerance is, of course, an idea of the past. Being tolerant in 2016 is not enough. Being tolerant can be extremely patronizing because it still establishes this imbalance between me, the one who tolerates, and the one who's tolerated. I've also highlighted critical thinking. Now, of course, in the West, we believe that we are critical thinkers and that people in China, for instance, are not critical and that we need to teach them to be critical thinkers. The problem is, of course, how do we define critical thinking and from whose perspective? That's really a big, big issue. And the last word, openness, I mean, that's something that personally I feel very uncomfortable with. Of course, they put it between inverted commas, so that's okay. But openness is a very slippery idea. How do you measure openness? Who measures openness? And what is openness? Openness can only be noticed through discourse. And we know that discourses are very unstable. So especially if you want to measure students, they might perform openness for you because they know that's what you're expecting. But 3 seconds later, because they are human beings, and we are also human beings, but we tend to forget that as researchers, we may not be as open as we would want to be. And it continues, this new system for measuring. Now, suddenly, democratic competencies becomes intercultural competencies. Isn't that interesting? I mean, I never thought they were synonyms for some reason, but now in the official, and the reason why I'm taking the Council of Europe is because it's a very influential institution. I mean, what they're doing is spreading like a virus around the world. You remember the work that they did on the European framework for languages. It started in Europe, it was contextualized in Europe, and for instance, 10 years ago when I was working in Hong Kong, I was asked to create courses, etc., in relation to the European framework. And so it's spreading. So now, if they are deciding on these objective intercultural/democratic competencies and a model to measure, this is going to spread again like a virus around the world, and suddenly a little place called Strasbourg will decide on how we understand this term, all around the world. I'll skip some of this, but basically the idea is this, if you can measure, then when people apply for a job or training, they will be able to cite their level of attainment of empathy, not sure what that means, and critical thinking alongside their academic qualifications and language skills. So as much as today, when we talk about language skills, we ask one another, like, are you C1 or C2 or B1 or B2? In the future, when it comes to empathy, we'll be able to put on our CV, well, I'm B1 for empathy, and I'm sorry I couldn't go any higher because, I'm sorry, empathy is a two-way thing. It's based on interaction. It's based on minimum 2 individuals. So, yeah. Okay, this represents what I call really the archetype of the imagineering industry of intercultural competence that we've been witnessing over the last 20 years. Imagineering meaning, of course, engineering imaginaries about the other, about the self, about interaction, about intercultural communication. But of course, thank God, there are a lot of changes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to present some of the changes that are happening, some criticisms of these changes, because we need to be critical towards our own criticality in my presentation. I see a concept we need to revise again and again and again and again and again. And a lot of people tell me, but you keep revising it. When are you going to stop? And I'm like, well, when I die, I'll stop. But I'm not going to stop before that. So I've been quite negative now, and I'll continue to be negative, but I promise I will be more optimistic towards the end. Is that okay? Yes? I can smile, so that will add an extra dimension. Intercultural competence. First problem, very polysemic. So can mean many different things. At the same time, it can be also very empty. Now, if you remember in Europe, I'm talking about Europe because that's my context. In Europe, some years ago, the European Commission decided to have the Year of Intercultural Dialogue. And for that, they wrote a white paper on intercultural dialogue. And they kept using the term intercultural competence in the document. And I was desperately trying to find a definition of it, but there was no definition. And of course, being the EU, that's on purpose. Because if you start defining it properly, there'll be somebody in the Czech Republic or somebody in Portugal who will disagree, and then you have to start again and again. So it's so easy to use as an empty term, so everybody will think, yes, we agree, even though we have no idea what is it that we're talking about. And a lot of this is happening, in a sense, in research also. It's old-fashioned. Now, and we're all here for intercultural competence. I'll tell you why it's old-fashioned. I don't think it's old-fashioned. But I was talking to somebody at the Ministry of Education in Finland some months ago, And I used the word intercultural competence. And she looked at me and she said, how can you use that term? This is so old-fashioned. And I said, what do you mean it's old-fashioned? She said, well, I've just come back from Canada and I said intercultural something, and they told me, oh, but that's something of the past. You should talk about cross-cultural today, cross-cultural competence. And I looked at her and I said, and how would you define cross-cultural versus intercultural? And then she started babbling about, different cultures and encountering, etc. And I said, you're just changing the term, but you're doing exactly the same stuff. So I'll stick to intercultural, even though you think I'm old and old-fashioned. But there's something magic about this term also. I think that it became very popular because it sort of gives us the impression that we're going to live in a better world. We're going to be happy together in a sense. It is a victim of groupthink very often, I believe. Very interesting idea, but intercultural competence, and that's something I'll criticize later on, is very often very much about difference. And Belvaux, who published a very interesting book about ethnophilia recently, talks about the intercultural as pornography of difference. I think it's quite an interesting term. It's very provocative again, but it's very important. I mean, it's a very interesting criticism. And of course, the problem about intercultural competence is that it's over-relying on very faulty, between inverted commas, terms, such as culture, respect, diversity, open-mindedness, tolerance. I mean, all these terms are all over, but I think they're extremely, I'm not the only one thinking that, but they are very problematic. Think about respect, for example. I mean, respect, again, can be something very patronizing, because you can respect, but genuinely believing that what you do is better, or that your culture or whatever, your ways are better than the other. It's also, I mean, Abdallah Pretel in 1986 already said it's a marketing-oriented tautology. Basically what she said is that, when you say intercultural competence, you're saying the same thing twice. Because competence, if you think about communication and interaction, cannot but be intercultural in a sense. It's, if you go beyond the national border crossing, as we'll see later on, I agree with her. I mean, but of course, as researchers, we need an identity. For instance, I am professor of multicultural education. I can't just say that I'm a professor of education. That doesn't make sense. I need an identity. I need to represent something in a sense. Catechism. Can you guess what is BBD? These are probably the most used names in the literature in reference to intercultural competence, and very often they are used, but very rarely criticized. Can you guess the BBD? These are three gurus in relation to intercultural competence. Barham, Bennett, and Deirdorf. Yes. I was at a conference in China a month ago, or 2 months ago, or 3 months ago, I don't remember. And there was a Chinese scholar who was using Barham's model. Now, I love Mike, we're friends, and so on and so forth. But his model, like any model, needs to be criticized increasingly. And that Chinese scholar was using his model, and she was talking about critical thinking, citizenship, and all that stuff in the Chinese context, and no criticism whatsoever. And something very interesting happened, because there was another Chinese scholar sitting there in the lecture hall, and she raised her hand at the end and said, you're talking about critical thinking, but you're in China. How do you deal with this? What's this critical? What are you talking about here? Do you talk about human rights? Do you talk about democracy here? I mean, are you too? And of course, the other scholar, she had no reply. She said, no, Barham defines it in a different way, blah, blah, blah. But so this, this lack of criticism, this catechism, again, using these models, is really problematic. Maybe like Ricoeur, Ricoeur said there are a lot of concepts that are very sick. It's negative, but I'm sorry, I said I would be negative. And he says there are two options. Either you kill the concept or you heal it. Intercultural competence is a sick concept that we need to heal. And that's what I'm going to try to do. I mean, I'm not trying to heal it, but some possibilities. Now, when we talk about intercultural competence, I see at least 4 different ways of researching and teaching about it. And in order to describe the 4 different ways, I'm using the dichotomy, and I'm sorry it's a dichotomy. Apparently dichotomies are typically European, but when you think of the Chinese yin and yang, isn't that a dichotomy? But never mind. Anyway, so the liquid and the solid, okay? I believe that there's a solid way of doing intercultural competence that is dying out at the moment, and then there are liquid ways of doing it, of doing intercultural competence. But I've also added a dimension which I call the Janusian way of doing intercultural competence. Probably that doesn't make any sense to you at the moment, but I'm hoping that at the end of my presentation, you'll understand. I'm going to go through each and every one of them now. The solid way of doing intercultural competence is basically what we would want to call the old way of looking at intercultural competence, which basically consists in pigeonholing people into cultures, languages, races, ethnicities, etc., etc., which makes people acting like tectonic plates that move against each other, the clash of cultures, the clash of civilizations. And the solid approach to intercultural competence, of course, will lead to essentialism, culturalism, or culturism, where culture and one identity takes over and becomes more important than other aspects of identity. And this solid approach to intercultural competence is very often coupled with other isms like native speakerism, sexism, East-Westism, etc., etc. This is usually this. So facts about a target culture. If you learn facts about a target culture, you're able to communicate with others. Etiquette, the do's and don'ts. Can I tell you which was the most ridiculous etiquette I ever read about India? The first time I went to India, I remember, when you take a guidebook about a country, and we all do it, we all read them. We don't want to admit, but we all read them, and they are important, of course. There's always a section called etiquette, where they tell you things to do, not to do, and how the local people are. Interestingly, very often, the description of the people, if you take, for instance, a guidebook on Finland, a guidebook on France, a guidebook on the US, very often the etiquette, the description of the people, they are polite, but a bit reserved. You would find these very similar. But something about India that was interesting was that when you go shopping in India, never point at a thing that you want to buy using your foot. So you go to Macy's, there's a beautiful shirt. There's something about feet, obviously, but that was such an interesting comment. So when I was in India the first time, I didn't move, basically. I was so scared, that I might use my feet for something. And of course, the solid intercultural competence has this idea that, they are pure, between inverted commas, representatives of national cultures. Well, of course, and this is passé already. This doesn't make sense. And of course, an overemphasis on cultural difference. And there's a wonderful quote from Erikson that summarizes a little bit, what this solid approach to intercultural competence is interested in. They're interested very much in tradition, associated with roots and the past, but a fear of Creole culture. Creole culture, again, is a tautology. Culture is Creole. Culture is, is a mixture of different cultures, whatever you want, whatever meaning you want to give to the term, hybrid forms and global universals. For example, and he gives the example of McDonald's, but also the example of discourses on human rights, because there's a universal way of seeing human rights that comes from the West, but that needs to be increasingly questioned, of course. I'm reading a book at the moment on water as a universal, and I think that's absolutely fascinating. We have all these elements around us that, that are used across cultures, across contexts, etc. But instead of talking about these and what they represent in terms of commonalities, we'd prefer to look at them from a differential perspective. For Holiday, of course, this is very much the Hofstadian legacy. Hofstede, this businessman, not a researcher, businessman, which is, of course, being rejected in mass at the moment around the world. I mean, Hofstede, Hall, Edward T. Hall, who did some wonderful work, is being really questioned in 2015. I mean, for instance, there are still people who are using very much Edward T. Hall's work today to measure intercultural competence. I mean, I think that's a little bit, well, we need to question that. I mean, 1950s, this is 2015. It's a very, very different world. Now, the second, so that was, I'm not going to spend too much time on the solid because I think that, everybody has been criticizing it and we're a little bit sick and tired of this. But I think that there's a second way, which I call the Genesian intercultural approach to intercultural competence, which, is a hint at the two-faced god Janus, who had two faces. The Genesian intercultural competence basically is this approach where people are still very much, basing their approach on solid culture, national culture, people as homogeneous representatives of a country or a culture. But on the other hand, they're moving to a more open, a more constructivist approach to the intercultural. So what they do is there is still this pigeonholing into cultures, etc., but at the same time, some sort of opening up to more diversities from within to, the multiplicity of identities. Just to make it concrete, a year ago, I attended a conference where somebody was going to talk about Italian students in Finland, and she started by reminding us that we all have different identities, that we are diverse, etc. But her whole presentation was based on the fact that these kids are Italian and what they do is typically Italian. So there was this sort of contradiction which she didn't even notice in a sense. So in the Genesian approach, in a sense, there's this lack of awareness of the fact that what we're saying about intercultural competence is contradictory in a sense. Now, let me move on to the proposals of what's happening at the moment in relation to intercultural competence that is quite fascinating, I think. So there will be two different models, if I may call them this. The first one is called the liquid idealistic, and the fourth one, liquid realistic. And this is my proposal. That's what I've been working on over the last year and a half. The liquid approach to intercultural competence is interested in the diverse diversities of every single person who has to demonstrate their intercultural competence. It is said to be non-essentialistic, non-culturalistic. So, for example, it means that people who work from this perspective do not believe that it's culture that makes people, but that it's people that make culture. And they accept and try to demonstrate that interculturality is ideological, that whenever people from different countries, different cultures meet, there's ideologies about who they are and who the other are, and that these can clash in a sense. The difference between number three, I will explain that in more details now, and the one that I'm proposing is that I will use the word simplexity. People are getting tired of this idea of simplexity, but I think that number three is very problematic because it gives the impression that you can reach the complexity of the individual, that you can reach their multiple identities, that you can reach the complexity of what's happening when people from different cultures, different countries meet. But of course, that doesn't make sense. I mean, complexity is complex and therefore cannot be reached, especially, for researchers. So what I'm claiming is that I think that a more realistic approach to intercultural competence would be for people to be aware of simplexity. What I mean by simplexity is that the complex always works with the simple. And there's no way we can reach complexity and there's no way we can reach simplexity. We're always navigating between these two elements. we can see snapshots of complexity and very quickly go back to the simple, because we are social beings, human beings, and there's no way that these things here can grasp this complexity. Now, so what I'm going to do now, and these are, this is what I've called in my work renewed intercultural or renewed interculturality. And these are names of people who are working from similar perspectives, in a sense, who are contributing to reassess and revise directly or indirectly intercultural competence. And as you can see, they are really from different contexts. Now, here are the principles of the idealistic or realistic approach, or the liquid approach to intercultural competence. Basically, these approaches claim that IC entails, first of all, as I said, diverse diversities, taking into account that people are all diverse, and that it's not just a section of our societies that is diverse. The reason why I'm saying that is that in the Nordic countries, when we talk about cultural diversity, when we talk about diversity, we refer to the other. So basically, diversity means the migrant. And we are not diverse. We are, I don't know what. But we need to question that. And so I've just taken some excerpts from literature. Usually I mix, fiction and research, because I think that we need to sort of cut down the boundary between these two. I think that fiction is very inspiring also for what we are doing. So this is from Shafak, who talks about a Turkish migrant in England, and who very clearly reminds us that, she notices that her neighbors in England are quite different, quite diverse amongst themselves, just like in her country, that, for instance, Turks and Kurds are different from one another, but also that some Kurds are completely unlike other Kurds in, for instance, the village where she used to live. And that's something that we need to work with and bear in mind. Another example from another writer, Ahmed, who talks about Muslims, and tells us that I think it's from Pakistan, if I'm not mistaken, he says, I have female relations my age who cover their heads, others who wear miniskirts, some who are university professors or run businesses, others who choose rarely to leave their homes. I suspect if you were to ask them their religion, all would say Islam. But if you were to use that term to define their politics, careers, or social values, you would struggle to come up with a coherent, unified view. And when you see discourses about Islam at the moment in Europe, for instance, we are really far away from this, in terms of how we talk about Muslims. In research, Ewing, the anthropologist Ewing, have said exactly the same, but from a research perspective. So she reminds us that, she argues actually, that in all cultures, people can be observed to project multiple, inconsistent self-representations. And for me, that's a key word, inconsistent. We are, as social beings, very inconsistent and sometimes incoherent. This self, I'm reading the other underlined bit, that this self may quickly be displaced by another, quite different self, which is based on a different definition of the situation. And this is maybe what we are missing in relation to intercultural competence. Intercultural competence doesn't exist without the presence of another. So judging about intercultural competence of one individual without working on either their interlocutor, other interlocutors, but also imagined interlocutors in their heads, it's actually really unfair because we're missing that bit. It's a part of the jigsaw that we need. Intercultural competence is about interaction. And the fact that we are inconsistent in how we define ourselves, how we construct ourselves, is because we have to deal with other people. We have to construct who we are with other people, and depending on the power relations, depending on our feelings towards the other, if you meet somebody from another country who is very good looking, for example, the way you behave, the things you might say about yourselves as a representative of a culture might be influenced by your feelings towards the person. But of course, we never talk about these things because it's not politically correct, is it? Okay, no, so that was the first principle, diverse diversities. The second one is intersectionality. That's becoming a bit of a cliche, so I won't talk too much about this, but it's not because we talk about intercultural competence that we have to stick to culture, ethnicity, and race. We also need to look at the socio-economic, the political, historical categories that have an impact on what's going on when people interact with each other. The third point is related to what I was saying about interaction. And I love the phrase by Maffesoli, a French sociologist who talks about the collective ego. We live in a mad world where we keep repeating that we are individualistic versus the Chinese, for instance, who are collectivistic. Everybody's collectivistic. We need other people to survive. We construct who we are. The ego doesn't exist without the collectivity. So when we concentrate only on the I, the pronoun, when we talk about intercultural competence, again, we're missing the hyphen between the I and the others. So individualistic approaches are really problematic, but the literature is full of them. And as researchers, for example, we need to go beyond mere ventriloquation. What this means is it's not because somebody claims that they've developed intercultural competence or that they claim that they've become less racist or more open-minded, etc., that it is a proof that they've developed intercultural competence, democratic competence, etc. Just repeating word for word what these people are saying is not an evidence of anything because, of course, when they're talking to us and talking about their intercultural competence, they are co-constructing with us their competencies. I always find it very funny that, of course, as researchers, we do action research, so we work on intercultural competence, etc. But very often what I notice is that, I've done it as well, and I'm sure I'm still doing it, we take quotes from students, for instance, who said, oh yeah, I've learned a lot in your course, I'm more open-minded, I'm more tolerant, etc. So we take this quote and, oh, look, yeah, it is working. But what did we ask them? What was the question? And knowing them, having this intertextuality between us that tolerance is good. I mean, in Finland, we have all these silly surveys at the moment about, we want to show that, student mobility is beneficial because, of course, we're investing a lot of money. So, so we have pressure from the EU to do all these silly surveys about global mindedness, global whatever. And, of course, the results always are, yes, students come back, they're more open-minded, they're more tolerant, they're more clever, they're more blah, blah, blah. Which is silly, especially when you look at the content of the surveys, because they're very biased. There's one survey about the Center of International Mobility. One of the questions was like, after my stay abroad, do I think that I've become, 1, more tolerant, 2, less tolerant, 3, racist? I don't know. Well, if I say racist, then basically, you paid for my trip, so I'm saying that you wait. But the world is full of this sort of stuff, But then we're happy because we can tell the EU, look, you're not wasting money. It's very useful. We're sending the students and they're learning. Okay, number 4, commonalities, differences. I want also this continuum to be central in intercultural competence. The pornography of difference has to stop. It's irritating, counterproductive, and of course very biased, as much as what I'm saying is biased, by the way. And I like this term that Maffesoli, I'm going back to Maffesoli again, he just proposed, he said, maybe we should talk about universalism. Now that's translated from French, universalism, I can't even pronounce it properly. So the idea that there is diversities, but there's also commonalities between us. Because there's always this fear, when we talk about similarities and commonalities, some of you will be throwing rocks probably at me in a minute saying, this is a very universalistic approach. you believe that the whole world is like you. No, I do insist on the two, universal, but also these specificities in a sense. But we need these, two aspects and not just drop into either the similarities alone or the differences alone. So universalism sounds good. Then, of course, we're proposing to be more political and not just neutral in relation to intercultural competence. And, in Finland, we've just discovered the word social justice. It took a while. But it sounds good. I'm still not sure what we mean by it, but never mind. So this sort of political approach, because especially in language learning, the political is not very present. I don't know about your practice, but I visited quite a few lessons in Finland where it's still about, when you talk about England, it's still talking about the Queen and Big Ben and all that stuff, but very, very little about, class differences and, injustice and all that stuff. Also one aspect, but it's more like from my point of view, I think that what we are missing about intercultural competence is the idea that when we communicate with others, a lot of the things that we say, a lot of the things that we do are based on imaginary, on dreams. And these aspects are very difficult, impossible to control, but we need to take them into account. Obviously, I think that all of us here, we have specific interests in certain parts of the world, but there are other parts of the world that we're not maybe that interested in. I think we have the right. And anyway, what I've noticed getting old is that you change. So, for example, I'm not going to mention any country, but I'm sure that Anna-Lena, Ali, and Etta will know what I'm referring to here. Where are they, by the way? Etta and Ali. Oh, you're there at the back, hiding. For example, if I meet somebody from, let's say, the Philippines, I'm really excited because I love the Philippines, okay? So it means that in terms of intercultural competence, what I'm going to be trying to do might be very different if I met somebody from, and I'm not going to mention any country, but let's say Mars, in which I'm not really interested. And of course, this has an impact. But also, for example, when you meet somebody, there is intertextuality. Sometimes you have the impression that you've met the person before because they remind you of somebody that you either liked or unfortunately disliked. And when that's a dislike, then usually you have to fight a bit. And these things are very difficult to control. Smells, perfume, a piece of jewelry that reminds you of somebody that you liked or didn't like. A first name. When you meet somebody for the first time and they have the first name of somebody you don't like, in a sense you have to struggle a little bit, and that might have an impact on what's going to happen. And this is part of the stuff that we can't really control, and we have to let it go, in a sense, and we need to talk about this stuff. And number 7, of course, we live in a world of success. Being a failure is bad. Though, I don't know if you know, but Finland is not doing very well at the moment, economically and all that stuff. We invented the yearly day of failure. It's on October the 25th. And of course, everybody's like, oh, Finns are so wonderful. Now they admit and they're happy about being a failure. Anyway, but in terms of intercultural competence, I think that's so important. We are so allergic to failure. I went to the dentist before coming here because I had an issue with a tooth, and like everyone, I hate dentists. The sounds and blah, blah, blah. And what really surprised me, because I never had this sort of operation, is that from the beginning, he said, you're not going to suffer. We're just going to delete it. You won't be suffering a second. And I didn't suffer. And I thought that was interesting. But sometimes for intercultural companies, it's like going to the dentist. We don't want anybody to suffer. We don't want anybody to face challenges or whatever. And this sort of, painless, clean version of intercultural competence is maybe not the right way of doing it. I'm not a sadomasochist, I want to say, but yeah. Just some quotes from famous people, because of course, when I'm talking here, it's not really me talking, it's me and these people talking together. I mean, all these ideas, of course, are based on where we are. So Levi-Strauss, 1966, who reminds us that, diversity is not just between cultures, but within cultures. And he mentioned at the time castes, classes, professions, religious denominations, etc., etc. About the instability and collective ego, of course, the work of G, for example, is very useful. To see the changes in the way we construct ourselves. About universalism, a quote from Hannah Arendt with an H there that should be at the end of the first name. If people were not different, they would have nothing to say to each other, and if they were not the same, they would not understand each other. Carl Sagan. That's exactly what I think about intercultural competence, as I said at the beginning. If we ever reach the point where we think we thoroughly understand who we are and where we came from, we will have failed. So that's what I would say about intercultural competence. When we found the solution, or we believe we found the solution to intercultural competence, we failed. So it's good that we are still continuing. And finally, Marina Abramovic, whom I adore, a performance artist who, I think that what she's saying about the sort of work that she's doing is intercultural competence to me and many of you. You never know how the experiment will turn out. It can be great, it can be really bad, but failure is so important because it involves a learning process and it enables you to get to a new level and to other ways of seeing your work. Now, of course, it's not about failure, but it's about this balance between, aspects of success and failure as well. Okay, so intercultural competence. Basically, if we try to refocus on that based on the idealistic and realistic approaches, first of all, move beyond the programmatic and recipe-like intercultural competence. Reject simple progression, like stages. Claims and agrees that intercultural competence is based on contradictions, instabilities, discontinuities, because of the different power relations, because we have to enter into interaction to do intercultural competence, dreams, feelings, etc. Intercultural competence is not static but changeable. Intercultural competence should entail discomfort, entering risky territories and some degree of pain, and a little hint at the dentist here. In a sense, through my work, I believe that nobody is better than others in terms of intercultural competence. Nobody's perfect, nobody is saint. And for instance, when you think about assessments or measurement, I find it very difficult to believe that somebody can judge other people's intercultural competence because, in a sense, by doing this, we are establishing a hierarchy between the one who knows how to do it and the one who may not know how to do it. I believe that sometimes we can do it, sometimes we can't, and so on and so forth. Intercultural competence relies mostly on discourses and actions, of course, but the problem about actions, when you ask people to perform intercultural competence, well, that's the word perform. They will perform it for you and with you, so it is unstable par excellence, in a sense. Something, I think that everybody has intercultural competence, because if you go beyond the country and the national culture thing, on a daily basis, we have to do interculturality, even with people who share the same language, etc., etc. So this means that I don't really believe, like many of you, probably into the measuring, but that's something that we can discuss. And I probably have like 1 second left, or 5. Wow. I'm sure that it's not very clear to you what was the difference between the idealistic and the realistic approach, liquid approach to intercultural competence. So I'm going to try to explain to you here what is it. The realistic approach basically says that there are no miracles to intercultural competence. I think that the idealistic approach still believes that we can do miracles. Sorry, I thought I was going to be positive, but I'm not, actually. Oh, it's terrible. Of course, the idea of my talk, as I said, is to provoke discussion. I'm not saying that I'm right or I'm wrong or whatever. The idea is for us to enter really into a dialogue afterwards, and maybe to fight. A bit of blood would be good in intercultural competence. Oops. So the idealistic approach seems to be believing that you can get rid of essentialism. That in a sense, you can lead students to avoid boxing, stereotyping, etc. That doesn't make sense. I don't think it's possible. And of course, I won't get a Nobel Prize for this, but it's not possible. And in a sense, it is a bit patronizing to tell people, you mustn't have stereotypes, you mustn't be essentialistic, because they are human beings. And I'm afraid that we are all essentialistic up to a point. And in a sense, I wonder if by claiming that, we can get rid of all this stuff, we are behaving like Pygmalion, who's sort of trying to create an ideal image that actually doesn't exist. And I think that sometimes when I listen to researchers, especially researchers who work from this perspective, sometimes I feel that they're doing self-congratulating. Yes, we made it, no stereotypes, no essentialism, etc., etc. I had an argument with, a nice argument with a very well-known researcher who is a friend of mine last year, where that person was claiming that racist people can be transformed. Well, I have some issues about this, because first of all, who can claim not to be racist? Who are the racist people and the non-racist people? And second of all, how can we test this? How can we measure this? So of course I can say, I'm not a racist, but I can't control that in some situations. Yeah? And that's awful. But I think that, making people believe that they can get rid of stereotypes and non-essentialism, etc., is very castrating. Because it's like, it's telling you that you have to do something that you can't do. And when students notice that, they can get very upset about it, because they feel they're not good enough. They were told by their lecturers that they have to avoid this. Essentialism, of course, is a universal sin. No one is immune against it. No one is a saint because of these and because of what I said before. So instead of trying to destroy essentialism, as maybe we're trying to do, and I've contributed to that. Again, a year ago, whatever I published a year or 2 years ago, when I read through it, I'm like, well, this is me. This is what I was trying to do. Maybe instead of doing that, examining how and why essentialism is happening, and maybe up to a point, how I can sort of try to pull towards non-essentialism, knowing that I'm not going to go there fully. Maybe that's more like a realistic approach. And that's where the idea of simplexity can become useful. Simplexifying intercultural competence means accepting that one cannot access its complexity, but navigate like Sisyphus rolling up his boulder up a hill between the simple and the complex. Thank you. You can see Sisyphus there. It's going up, and then it's going to go down, and he's going to have to do it again. And that's why intercultural competence is about, because I'm torn apart between simplicity and complexity. There's no way I can reach into a state of full intercultural competence or a state of null intercultural competence. Complexity, of course, is an ideal, and what I said earlier, we still need to include dreams and ideals, etc. But in teacher education, for example, I don't think that it really helps. Non-essentialism, of course, is an ideal as well. So, maybe to summarize, intercultural competence, I see, is there. As we've seen, there were 4 at the beginning, 4 ways of doing intercultural competence, but I've removed the Januszian here. There was the solid approach, which is basically the rock, as you can see there, stays there and remains solid and leads to full essentialism and culturalism without being aware of it. On the other side, we have the liquid idealism, where complexity, non-essentialism, and full intersectionality can be reached. So basically the rock will fall, and then that'll be it. We've succeeded to reach a stage of intercultural competence. The one that I'm suggesting, of course, is the one in the middle, which is the simplex, liquid, realistic approach to intercultural competence, which is, I think, modest because it accepts that nobody is perfect, that we are all torn apart between, stereotypes and maybe moments of enlightenment, etc., etc. And also, we are ready to admit it. We're ready to admit that in some situations we fail, and that it's okay to fail as long as failure can lead to reflecting with the other on what we are doing, what we're not. Of course, somebody like Adrian Holiday, a good friend of mine, a wonderful researcher, would say, but Fred, that's not enough. It's not enough because we live in a mad world. Well, maybe it's not enough, but I think that in a mad world like ours, maybe realism in education is something important. To summarize, there's a paradigm change that has been going on for quite a while now. That's wonderful. We suggest to go beyond programmatic approaches to intercultural competence, beyond culture as an excuse, beyond culture as an explanation for everything. But I would be tempted to push through the agenda of a more realistic and modest approach that maybe can help us to go beyond what I would call neo-imagineering of interculturality, making people believe that they can get rid of the bad things about the intercultural, like racism and stereotyping and essentialism and culturalism, etc. This approach means that, of course, as researchers, practitioners, decision makers, we need to step off our pedestal and to start looking at the influence that we have on what we're doing, and to accept that also as trainers, researchers, etc., we fail, and that we can't be there, look down, and judge if this is good, this is not good, this is good, this is bad, because it sort of assumes that I'm better, and I'm not better. I'm at the same level as everyone because this is so unstable. The idea of simplexity, well, that nobody seems to be understanding, but that's okay, it could be an opening in a sense. So you're all probably wondering, okay, now, so what do we do? How do we define intercultural competence? Because, of course, we're still all very much interested in proposals. So I'm going to show you a definition between inverted commas that I'm still working on. I'm changing all the time because, of course, you can never be satisfied. Intercultural competence, based on what I've talked about, would be becoming aware of, recognizing, pushing through, presenting/defending, and questioning assumptions about one's identification or identities, if you like, and diverse diversities as well as those of other people, my interlocutors or people that I'm talking about or concerned with. That's the first aspect. Second aspect, renegotiating these elements in a satisfactory, now note that I've put satisfactory in red and inverted commas because I have no idea which word to use. I mean, I feel like I'm being dilaudiered of when I say satisfactory, but what does it mean? Or efficient. I'm not sure. For who? So in a satisfactory manner with and for our interlocutors in specific contexts and ad infinitum, meaning it's a lifelong thing that will never, ever stop. And stop. Great. There you go. Thanks very much.